As fantasy football trade deadlines approach, we are going to dive into Shawn Siegele's tiers of the running back rankings ahead of the deadline to see what he would be willing to trade, move to get these players, and to see if he can improve those rosters, or if you can improve your rosters to make that final push for the championship. So that is what we're talking about today on RotoViz Overtime. It is, Shawn, the episode that's going to come out post Thanksgiving. We are recording this on Thanksgiving, Thursday, the 23rd of November. So I want to start off by saying happy Thanksgiving to Shawn. I know there's lots of our listeners that will celebrate it. We also have listeners all over the world, so it's different everywhere. Myself and Shawn were talking off air during the last episode. If there's anything special that is done in Ireland, it isn't really a holiday here, I would guess, but I'm going to enjoy watching the additional games for Thursday night's triple, double, quadruple header, whatever we want to call it. So much extra NFL on this week, so looking forward to that. So happy Thanksgiving to everyone who celebrates. If you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, happy Thursday, happy Friday when you get this episode. Have a good day, I hope. But Shawn, I want to start off by saying very, very thankful to do this show with you, to have the community that we have for RotoViz OT, to have the interactions with the listeners that we do. It really does mean a huge amount. We also are fortunate enough, Shawn, to work in this industry and have a game that we play become a job that we do, and that is very special as well. But thanks to everyone listening in that give us that opportunity, and then also, Shawn, thanks to you for I've lost track of time how many episodes of this show we have done together. It's always a lot of fun.
It is always a lot of fun. And I think even as, you mentioned this sort of a historical American holiday, that the global nature of fantasy football and certainly the reach that I think you have provided and continue to cultivate with this show has meant a lot to me. And so it's really cool to get questions and interaction with listeners from all over the world. And we certainly wish everybody, happy holidays as we move into, these next couple of months where so many people are celebrating so many different and exciting things. Colm, one of the things that I'm very thankful for right now is that you and I have our main event team in first place. And with 1 week to go, that's always exciting. You never want to count your chickens, but we do have a good projection for this weekend. You and I have had a little better injury luck than most of the teams. And so we actually have a situation where we have two really highly projected players on our bench this week. And, if you get to where you have that depth, then you're probably going to make some start sit and misses. And at the same time, you do feel a lot more comfortable about what your margin is going forward. Week 11 for most of the other teams didn't go particularly well, but I'm also very grateful for the fact that of the 9 main event teams that I'm doing, 8 of them are competing for a playoff spot this week. And, especially when you consider all of the extreme highs and extreme lows of the 2023 season, that's a lot of fun. So the start sit decisions this week have been very stressful. I have a lot of games on Thursday where you gotta go ahead and put your money down, put that where your mouth has been all year pretty early this week. And then, as you mentioned, the triple header today, the game tomorrow. But Colm, the other big note that we have here is that despite losing Justin Jefferson and some other players in our dynasty league, it's fighting in the middle of the playoff bound teams. We'd really like to win there. A couple extra weeks with that, obviously, week 13 and 14, also part of the regular season, but the trade deadline is upon us. We have a couple more days to make FFPC trades. And so for the Zero RB universe this week, I still included plenty of pieces of relevant information in terms of opportunity, week 11 usage, the expected points profiles, all of those peripherals for the runners, and some key route information. But I wanted to frame it within this context of thinking about where these running backs sit right now in Dynasty. So, Colm, let's jump in and give the listeners a sense of where we are. The first note for me was that even though I'm still very high on his prospects long term, I do think that the situation with Bijan Robinson, where they drafted a generational running back and yet their run game has deteriorated this season, that has caused issues for him. He's had a little trouble. He had a game where he didn't stay healthy. That, when you miss a game with an illness when you were active, it makes your numbers on a per game basis look worse. But he's
tried to follow some of that T. Higgins, game ritual, be out there but don't play. Then when you do play, don't do much in some of these games. But
Colm,
don't put that juju out there.
No. The last thing we need in the world is another T. Higgins situation. So I don't want to overstate this. Bijan Robinson still is my number one running back, although our other favorite is right on his heels. But he does, for me, drop out of that top tier that we represent in our dynasty rankings and our dynasty tiers as being worth 3 first-round picks. I have it down to 2 first-round picks and the top guy here in tier 2. What else do you see here in this top group that jumps out to you?
Well, obviously it's to have none in that tier 1 is probably the first thing. You have mentioned it, but just to highlight to the listeners. So for these players in tier 2, we'd be giving up 2 first-round picks. And Shawn, the Bijan Robinson situation is, concerning. It started off with highlight plays, with positivity for a rookie being used early in the season. But as it has tapered on, it has become concerning. More reports this week with Arthur Smith saying that he will be more involved. But at this point, I pretty much ignore everything that is said by Arthur Smith. But we'll see what happens with Bijan Robinson this week and then moving forward. With the talent is really not in question. But and Shawn, I'm not putting this out there either, but with the Falcons, we've seen having talent not been in question is not always the issue to getting production on the NFL field. Breece Hall is in here, Shawn. Christian McCaffrey is in here. And then it is rounded out by Achane and JAHMYR GIBBS. And we know how the season started out. And over the last week, there's been obviously disappointment with Achane. We'll see. We're recording this before Thursday Night Football. I wouldn't expect him to be involved, but promising that he had been even a limited participant in practice this week. The upside there is just so high. And, we have seen this Miami Dolphins offense not functioning the way it did in those opening weeks with him absent from the lineup. So I'm not surprised to see him in there. JAHMYR GIBBS, who again will be playing on Thursday Night Football against the Packers in a game that should be really set up for them to dominate the run game against a poor Packers run defense. Talent is exceptional. And just looks fantastic. And, we're splitting hairs when we're saying which of these is in which order. But I could see him really pushing himself up to be at the higher end of this conversation over the final stretches here off the NFL season. Breece Hall, though, Shawn, he was somebody I mentioned on the recap show in terms of the production that he has had in this tough situation, particularly over, you have mentioned in this article, over the last 6 games that he has been available. That's week 5 through week 11. He has had 2 games where it was a 10-point game and a 10.5 point game, but over that time he's averaged 18.1 PPR points per game, a 28.4, a 20.3, a 21.3, and 18.3 game. So he is really doing fantastic work. He's been in an RB1 67% of the time in that stretch, and in a situation that has been very difficult. I think it's been overlooked I think he's actually enhanced his reputation in a situation where people may be thinking that all hope is lost for the Jets. The quarterback change will be interesting to see here. But Breece Hall followed by Christian McCaffrey. Christian McCaffrey is at the high end of this if he's 4 years younger. His age is the only thing that you'd be thinking of any less for him. I mentioned that streak for Breece Hall over the last couple of weeks, but over the last 10 games, Christian McCaffrey averaging 24.6 PPR points per game. An absolute juggernaut, continues to be amazing. An RB1 90% of the time. So I don't think there's any real surprises in that list, Shawn, but I just wanted to highlight again, Breece Hall, even in the train wreck of a situation with Zach Wilson over the last kind of 2 months, has been able to have some fantastic numbers.
Yeah, and with Breece Hall, the element there that has made him so dynamic, and I think continues to surprise people even as he does it consistently, is that over that stretch, he's averaging almost 11 points per game purely as a receiver. And that was the thing that we saw again in week 11, where he only scores 2.3 points as a runner, the run game with the blocking that they have, with the lack of respect for the passing game, is very difficult.
There's
and yet
nothing there.
But
no
he still
running
rescues that game with 8.9 receiving expected points and then 7.1 receiving fantasy points over expectation. So a lot of people are going to be saying that elements of Hall's profile are unsustainable, and yet the negative portions of it are probably also unsustainable, certainly for the long term, maybe even in the short term. Maybe we get better quarterback play, and that explosiveness is an element that gives him a chance any individual week to really blow up. I think he can score even more points. You mentioned GIBBS. The situation for him and Achane, with Achane right now, especially, we're looking at injury. But with GIBBS and Achane, you're probably needing to get huge efficiency, at least over the short and intermediate terms, maybe even over the long term, which would be frustrating. But in order to get the production that you really need to have them in this tier, not to have them be playable. I mean, they're going to be playable either way. And yet, I think that especially with GIBBS and having him be healthy right now and having him shockingly be the #1 back in evasion rate for the full season, that you are talking about the possibility that everybody in this group is more valuable than Robinson until Arthur Smith is fired. And that's certainly something that would have been a surprise, if we talked about it 6 weeks ago. Christian McCaffrey.
The other part on that, Shawn, moving forward with obviously the Jets thing, it could improve. You get Aaron Rodgers back in there, or potentially a different quarterback that makes them respect the passing game. But when you look at the Dolphins and the Lions, and I mentioned this to you before we started recording, in terms of fantasy production, I think the one that you could probably think is going to be potentially the most consistent with more than 3 or 4 players. So if we're going beyond AJ Brown and Devontae Smith, for example, and DeAndre Swift and that offense, but we're spreading it out to the tight end, to the wide receiver, to the running backs, where there's 2 running backs, there's a quarterback. Spreading it out, I think the Lions might be the most comfortable in terms of being able to put up fantasy points, I would say, over the next 12 months. We'll see post-NFL draft. But I also mentioned there with the efficiency that has kind of gone out of the Dolphins team with the running back missing. I think both of those guys are set up in better situations than BREECE Hall at this moment in time.
Yeah, it's that sort of permanent tension between the market share. Well, I mean, all these guys I think are extremely talented, but for when we're trying to split hairs between these players and trying to figure out that mix of floor and ceiling, it's tension between the size of the pie and your share of the pie. And so we'll see how that develops for these guys. Christian McCaffrey, always a back that, especially if you're not competing for a title, you're trying to think, can I get out? How much could I actually get back? I don't want to end up in a Dalvin Cook situation where I ride into 0. And yet it's just so difficult because you don't know that the cliff is coming.
Is he going to be in this tier until he retires? Is that where we're going? Is when's he slipping out of this tier?
Well, one of the issues too is that, you mentioned until he retires, but the answer would be no, unless he retires a little bit suddenly, like a Calvin Johnson or a Barry Sanders, in which case, again, you're kind of left with now you have nothing, where before you had somebody you could have traded for a lot of picks, and yet you just really can't afford to trade him. He is the one player in all of fantasy who gives you such a prohibitive advantage at that spot in terms of, marginal points that, yeah, you have to ride him and continue there and win titles all the way through. And we talk a lot about perpetual reloading, but the element is that if you've perpetually reloaded with everything else, then once you lose him, yes, it does dramatically change your team, and your team is still so powerful that you're going to be competing for the other titles. CMC is the unique guy where, because having him in your lineup dramatically changes your odds of winning that semifinal matchup or winning the final matchup, unlike really anybody else, because in almost all other situations, when we talked at the top about how on our main event team, we've got multiple very clear starters on the bench. Obviously, in your dynasty team, you want to have built to that point. And so saving other veterans who, maybe even their elite starters, is not necessarily going to change your odds of winning in the semis and the finals. Definitely not true of Christian McCaffrey. He is always a field tilter there. Colm, the second tier that we're going to discuss, actually the third tier overall, it's 1 first-round pick, 1 second-round pick. It's a little disturbing to have these guys down here as opposed to at least up in tier 2. But things have not gone particularly well recently for Jonathan Taylor and Travis Etienne. I think these are the other 2 superstars from a talent perspective, but Taylor has not broken the long runs this year, and you and I have talked a lot about what Jacksonville has done with Etienne. Any disagreement on them being placed here as opposed to up in that top group?
No, I feel like they're, I don't think purgatory is the right word, but they are in between in terms of they're just not at the top level from what we've seen this season. I think they are the players, though, as we go through this list, that have the opportunity to grab themselves back up into that level. So they're right in between the next group of guys that we would kind of talk about as it tails down in terms of the picks you would give up and those 2. And I think the split is pretty fair. You're going from the guys we talked about already will be worth 2 firsts. We're looking in here to a first and a second, and then the next tier will drop down to a first round. So that feels about right. The Taylor situation has been a little bit tricky because obviously he misses the start of the season. So that is 0 points. That is difficult. But then when he comes back in, he's worked back in with Zach Moss being there. Now it looks like he's moving back into that full-time role. So there is chance for this to be salvaged. And between now and the end of the season, he does move himself back up. But there is also the possibility that if it doesn't all click here as we go towards the end of the season, that he could potentially move down as well into tier 4, which we'll talk about in a moment. I don't know if you agree with me that he, a bad finish at the end of the season here could also move him down. I know that sounds obvious, but for a player of his caliber, I think he could slide into tier 4 as well as possibly go up to tier 2.
Yeah, really wide range for Taylor because when you have Minshew out there, they're running a lot of plays. They do move the ball. Minshew can dump the ball off to Taylor much more often than we would expect Anthony Richardson might in the future. And you have that omnipresent threat of the big play. And so if Taylor even finished as the overall running back 1 from now until the end of the season, I don't think that would surprise people, and that would definitely push him up. If you do go the opposite way, then as he starts to age and as you move into an offensive situation in 2024 where, yes, Taylor should come in as one of the most efficient backs in the NFL, it would be shocking if he came in healthy and Anthony Richardson comes in healthy. If Taylor doesn't average 5+ yards per carry, with defenses also having to deal with the threat of Richardson, that would be a surprise. And yet you're going to remove a lot of high-value touches that balance out the yardage efficiency. And so if you don't have a strong finish here, then as people look to the overall offensive environment the following season, they're certainly not going to like that. I point out here that Travis Etienne, 5.8 receiving expected points per game. That constantly grates on me because he should be up in that range of EKELER and ALVIN KAMARA if the Jaguars were actually trying to take advantage of talent. Colm, the next tier
I'm
4.
sorry, you mentioned about that part. If they do that, that's his case to move into that top tier. And it'll not be a surprise to listeners that we have complained about the way they have used him in the running game. They have at times added in some nice wrinkles and some nice plays to get him on the edge, but he has had as a running back, he has had a really good season, but there's so much being left out there for Etienne in terms of, he's evading tackles, he's having missed tackles, he has the big playability, but it feels like the team are always just playing within themselves and not taking advantage of the talent that they have.
And I wrote a lot about Etienne in the preseason, with a big chunk of that focusing on the rhetoric coming out of Jacksonville that didn't follow the evidence. And Ben and I did kind of a fun segment, at least it was fun for me, on Stealing Bananas yesterday, going through the things that Tom Brady had said about the contemporary NFL and pointing out where we didn't think that probably fit what the facts were. And understanding the actual reality is an important starting point for deciding what you want to do tactically, or if you're trying to solve problems out there in the world, trying to figure out how you're going to solve these things that you care about. You need to understand what the current situation is to have any foundation for going forward. ETN's ability to hit the hole last season was extremely strong, and yet they were emphasizing that as something they wanted him to do better, and they felt he'd taken another step. The reason that I thought it was positive, the rhetoric overall, was they were claiming that he was improved, and they were claiming he was going to get a ton of work. Now, getting the ton of work has been the case, and you do love to see that there's this huge split between him and Bigsby. I don't know that we would have gotten Charbonnet really cutting into Walker if Walker had stayed completely healthy, because even before this current injury, he'd started dealing with nagging injuries. And if your guy has nagging injuries, then the first thing that goes off in your head is like, this is where we can play that other guy that we drafted in the second round, despite the fact that that's not good use of our team's resources. But the problem there is just the Jaguars' self-evaluation was very poor. Their understanding of what they had done in 2022. So the thing with ETN that is mind-boggling is his yards before contact, which is, again, a stat that a lot of people like to throw away, has dropped by a full yard per play. A yard every time you touch the ball. Every time throughout the course of the season, a full yard. That part is mind-blowing. And, you know, if it ever sounds like we're just kind of complaining because we want them to be blowing guys like 3 yards off the ball, we want him to be rushing for 30 yards every play, we just want different plays because this is a guy who's on our rosters. And I mean, there's certainly tiny. Yeah, we do want those things.
That's true.
The basis of it stems back to the evidence, which is pointing in a very negative direction for the offense, for the coaches. And, you know, if you want to put some of it on ETN, you can. But the reason that he has a much lower design gap rate this year is because if he runs into the design gap, there is nothing there. So unless you want a lot of extra carries for 1 or 0 yards, then you've got to fight for daylight when an NFL team is coming in the offseason and telling you to run into a wall. That's problematic just for a whole host of reasons. And so that's where our frustration on the ETN front kind of wraps back around into him dropping a little bit here in the dynasty rankings, because I did have him a little bit higher than this. I mean, again, his ability to generate big plays has gotten him to where he is. He's the kind of the weird running back where the yardage efficiency has been poor, and yet the fantasy points over expectation have been elite. And again, that's him finding ways on his own to overcome what the offensive situation is. Column tier 4, which is a round 1 pick. If you're going to acquire one of these guys at the trade deadline, then you should probably be willing to trade a first rounder. You want to start with something else, obviously. A player you don't need who still does have value, not somebody who is completely worthless, but a player that you're trying to move, maybe plus a second rounder, something to that effect. But these are the round 1 guys, and Colm, Saquon Barkley, despite another horrific offensive environment, has been impressive this season. He's been up at that 17 EP per game level, which, you know, you can kind of look at as a soft cutoff, that 16, 17 point per game range in terms of workload alone, that's going to get you into the middle of that RB1 tier. And his efficiency is going to be all over the map. I mean, obviously for individual backs, you're going to have the efficiency numbers bounce around, but especially with his big playability and in a bad offense, you don't know what you're going to get every week. But what you got last week was his second most efficient receiving day of his career. And the highlights definitely back that up. The other guy I have in here, DeAndre Swift. Colm, you've been high on him all season. You've been trading some of your first round picks to pick up DeAndre Swift. He had a little bit of a down stretch, but then he comes through against the Kansas City Chiefs and more or less wins that game for the Eagles, at least if you want to look at it from the offensive side. Plenty of defensive players making plays in the second half of that performance. A couple more games with tough matchups, but for the fantasy playoffs themselves, that's when the schedule flips. So one of the things the Zero RB Universe has been discussing over the past month, you know, which guys you want to move if you need to make the playoffs, which guys you need to acquire if you want to win in the playoffs. Those can be 2 different things depending on how the schedule chunks break out. Swift is the guy to acquire specifically if you want to win the whole thing. Do you have a preference among these 2 guys? Are these guys in the right tier?
I think they're in the right tier. I would have them in the opposite, and this is again splitting hairs. I would have Swift ahead. I think Swift's closer to moving up into that next tier than Barkley is. Barkley has been amazing the last couple of weeks. And he's in, you mentioned the situation, at the start when you're saying the start of the season, when you're thinking of a range of outcomes for the season, this is probably the worst range. Like, this probably is below the worst range of outcomes in terms of any quarterback that was going to be able to play with him got injured. And also the team has been in a really bad situation. So it's gone really bad, but he has been able to make the most of it. The one concern with Barkley, and obviously if you're doing this to win this season, you want to go ahead and try and win it. But Barkley is going to be 27 on the 9th of February next year. I didn't realize that. Shawn, myself, and Saquon Barkley share the same birthday, although he is 8 years younger than me. So I feel old now when I'm saying that. But in that situation, will be 27 entering next year. And then, as we know with running backs, and Barkley has almost resuscitated his value to this point, with the injuries, with coming back, with his play over the last couple of seasons. This has been kind of the high point of that. So I'm a little bit reluctant to try and acquire him if I was in that particular situation. But the only thing, Shawn, that doesn't have Swift and the tier above this for me with Taylor and Etienne is the fact that he doesn't have a long-term contract with the Eagles. Obviously traded with the Detroit Lions. They kind of acquired his rookie contract, and he's out of contract at the end of the season. And will they be able to pay him what he'll be looking for at the end of the season if he finishes the way that we think that he can finish and how he played this past week to help them beat the Chiefs? So the one part with the Swift side of it is he is 24, and obviously as he gets older, Shawn, like Barkley, he is going to age this year as well, but he'll be 25 in January, but still would have those couple of years off an advantage in terms of youth to be able to continue to play, even if he picks up a free agent contract somewhere else. But if he was going to be the Eagles running back, Shawn, for the next 2 seasons at this point, I think I would nearly have him just almost pushed directly into that first tier that we talked about with Achane, GIBBS, McCaffrey, and BREECE Hall. So would you be as aggressive as that if it was a situation that we knew that he was in this Philadelphia Eagles offense?
I think probably not, because of what you mentioned there, where unfortunately, like all of us, he's going to be a year older next year. And I think that he's going to have a little better luck, just like we're always projecting for Justin Jefferson. Again, on Justin Jefferson, it seems crazy because his scoring level is so high despite it. But you would expect that Swift is going to stop being tackled inside the 2-yard line.
That was the one prediction that we got. I did get right, Shawn, that he did get, there was 2 Jalen Hurts touchdowns this week from close range. But yeah, imagine if he's not getting tackled at the 1-yard line. We went through this, Shawn, with Ja'Marr Chase and Justin Jefferson over the last couple of years, where the numbers would have been astronomical if they just could get another yard ahead. Like if Swift starts to get in with a couple of those, I think we start to see him push up a lot higher here.
Yeah, my concern for Swift is similar to what I believe we articulated on the last show with Dalvin Cook, where Dalvin Cook's not washed up, right? He's no longer a superstar, but you can't bet on the market to place a running back in a decent situation. And so because of that, it's really easy to say, okay, the team that acquires him is going to want to use him dynamically.
The trouble with that is
no guarantee of that.
When it gets to the free market and free agency like that, a lot of the time the teams who are in the worst situation tend to have the most cap space. Not always, but then the player as well has to think, well, I'm going to be 25 years old. I have a chance to make this one contract. I have to try and get as much money as I can. And that also sometimes can cloud their judgment to making the best decision for what's going to help them on the field, because they have to think about what's going to help them financially as well.
Yeah, you can get in a situation where you essentially sign with a team like the Seahawks. Now, not specifically the Seahawks, you wouldn't think in this environment, but you sign with them, they do have money, and then they're looking at, we've acquired these picks, and a guy we have really high on our board in the 2nd round is also available, so we draft him. And now, your future market share doesn't look very good. The situation with Swift is you would expect him, in the same way that you would expect ETIENNE, to be used similar to EKELER and KAMARA. Maybe those guys aren't quite to the same level as receivers, but partly it's difficult to know because their teams have not pushed them at that point. Some of the value that you get with KAMARA right now is simply the volume, because he is not doing impressive things once the ball is in his hands, right? If you get a team that will use Swift in the receiving game and will use Swift at the goal line. I mean, you need a team that's going to use him like an Austin Ekeler, whereas the vast majority of teams are going to use him the way the Lions did last year, where he comes out for the goal line back. And so even at this price, I'm a little tentative with Swift, and I haven't been paying the first round price to acquire him this season because I'm concerned that so much of the value can vanish in an instant. But this is where I think that the value is. I love him as a player, partly, not acquiring more of him. And Dave Philippi, who we drafted with, who's been writing a fantastic article on Zero RB and mostly just running back dynasty values every week. He is partly he's a big Swift fan and he's a big Eagles fan. So he's been acquiring a lot of Swift. You have a definitely another analyst on your side there, really pushing the acquire Swift thesis. And I don't disagree with that, but I have enough Swift that I want to more or less stay where we are there. Colm, we get to the next tier, which is a couple of second round picks. And I do note a few things about how to think about first round picks, how to think about second round picks. Obviously, if you're looking to either trade or acquire a pick that's looking like the 201, looking like the 202, you're going to be thinking about that a little bit more, or you're just going to be thinking about it differently than a 205, 206. When we talk about the two second round picks, you're kind of thinking of it as the average of those picks, a little bit more in that 204, 205, 208 type of range. And also reference here one of the Triflex trades last year where I moved a first round pick for 3 second round picks. And there's no guarantee that's going to work out, even though I've hit with those picks to this point, right? If you end up in a situation where your own first round pick and that team is battling for the playoffs, and so especially once you've traded your first round pick, you're all in to go ahead and make it. It doesn't mean burning future value, but it does mean that you're not going to get to kind of the edge midway through the season and be like, let's point to the next year. You've moved your first round pick. You're pointing at this year in terms of everything you do battling throughout the contest. Anyway, that's the kind of value we're talking about. And this brings us to a player who's currently on our team. And it does raise the question, I think, of what we want to do with our dynasty team in the Triflex that has Kenneth Walker. Colm, we're in pretty good shape despite some of the players that we've lost. Should we be moving either Walker or our picks to try and add a little bit more firepower, since we no longer have Walker as someone who, even if he comes back and plays a decent amount down the stretch, it doesn't look like his situation is going to be league winning. Now, he could always break one of these big plays. Very few running backs match up to Walker as a talent. He leads all NFL backs in evaded tackles, and the kind of cool thing here is that split basically evenly between 16 broken tackles and 15 forced missed tackles. When you can make guys miss and then also run through them, the options you have available to you on any individual play are vast, and you see Walker using that creativity to both hit guys and to go around them. Now, he also has the lowest design gap rate in all of football, which some people love, some people hate. I like running to daylight. Don't smash yourself into the wall. The interesting thing is that you do have a very stark contrast between Walker and Zach Charbonnet, who is much higher in terms of design gap rate and has some decent peripherals, but is also one of the worst backs in the NFL to this point in evasion rate. One of the things that I talked about with him as a prospect is that the offense he played in probably made his peripherals in college look a little better than they were, but that doesn't mean that he's not good. It just means you want to keep those things in the back of your mind. Even though he hasn't jumped out here in fantasy yet, I think when you watch the Seahawks games, you are impressed with how he fits what they want to do. And so I certainly would expect Charbonnet to outscore Walker the rest of the way when you consider that Walker's not 100% right now. Now, again, that could flip, but where are you kind of placing Kenneth Walker in your own mental rankings, and what should we be doing to address this new hole in our roster?
With Walker, particularly if you have him on your roster like we do, I think moving him at this point is, compared to where he would have been 4 weeks ago, would be probably a mistake in terms of the missed value that you would have. In terms of Walker long term, if we're not talking about just the next 6-8 weeks, I think that the asset is still going to be very valuable. And I do think that he's a better running back than Charbonnet, but I think that it will be a split backfield here as we move forward. But that, I think if we get Walker back healthy, that can go back to, 60-40, maybe even 70-30. I think they can both complement each other. And I know there's people probably listening that are more on the Charbonnet side of things, but I think that while this is the issue that I get into with it, is you mentioned Charbonnet seems to fit better what they do, but I think that Walker's the better player. And I think that the team should try and build around the talent of the better players rather than stick to a system to try and have a less talented player have those opportunities. My concern with Walker is with this injury is that he may not now be 100% for the remainder of the season. So as you mentioned, when you have him, can you put him into your lineup, even if he is active, in terms of what can we expect? I don't know if we can expect the 17.4 points per game that he was averaging up to week 7, but I still think he can be a very usable running back for the remainder of the season. And if we're going on per game rather than total points, I still think that he'll outscore Charbonnet in points per game the rest of the way. But I think that Charbonnet is the edge, obviously, on total points, because I'm not confident in Walker's health as we move forward here. Shawn, with our team, we're fortunate enough that there's a few backs that we can plug in, but with the dynasty team, you mentioned the Justin Jefferson scenario coming back into that at the start of the show. If we were running away with our ranking in that league with him. He was giving us such an edge at that position, and without him, it's been a little bit more of a struggle in terms of our weekly results. But I think that the success of the season is likely going to be determined by him coming back and how he does versus what the running back position puts up in that team. Because the running backs we have, I think, are all guys that are in, on a weekly basis, that 10 to 15 points, rather than a player like a Jefferson who's going to put up the 30 points. So we don't have a running back in the Christian McCaffrey mold, for example, that is going to really break it for us each week. So I think that we're kind of in a situation here where I wouldn't be moving Walker. I would be trying to maybe move for one of the lesser running backs we may talk about in a moment to try and fill that gap as we move forward here.
We still have that BREECE Hall trade out. The fact that we haven't gotten a response on it probably means that there is no interest, but it could be a situation where that manager is kind of looking at his full options right up until the deadline. If we were able to pull BREECE Hall in, that would be nice. We do have running back mostly covered, although anytime that your two players in the starting lineup for any given week have questionable tags, that does start to give you a little bit of discomfort there. The issue is not so much the running back position as it is the flexes. In the triplex, you got to fill a lot of flexes, and that's the beauty of the format. And it also allows you and or forces you to be creative. When we take Walker out, our flex options are not nearly as good. So hopefully we'll have Justin Jefferson back to plug in there. But even once he goes in, then we're looking at 2 of the 3 of Jerry Jeudy, Quentin Johnston, and George Pickens being in the lineup. As listeners know, those guys are not scoring. And so if we could move an additional player in that group to the bench by acquiring a flex option, then that would be my preference, especially if we are indeed trying to win the whole thing, which I think this team is set up with a shot to do. Colm, as we move through the rest of this tier, this is a bigger tier, and there are names we love, names that maybe we're not as high on, but where the guy is performing, and you have to give him full credit for that. Tony Pollard, talked about as a buy low a week ago. He bounced back with his best game of the season. David Montgomery, he's at 14.5 expected points per game in this committee. Those are huge numbers. Detroit Lions, as you mentioned, scoring a lot of points. He's also outperformed that by 3 points per game. That might be tough to do, and yet when you're the goal line back for the Detroit Lions, outperformance is definitely possible. Javonte Williams, a lot of workload, not a lot of dynamism. Alvin Kamara and Austin Ekeler, some listeners probably would expect them to be higher. They rate number 1 and number 3 in expected points. They're the 2 guys who join CMC in terms of having that elite balance between rushing EP and receiving EP, but they're both really struggling as pure runners. Kamara's at 3.7 yards per carry and a 6.7 evasion rate. I mean, he's down there with Ezekiel Elliott as a runner. Ekeler is underperforming his rushing volume by more than 2 points per game. So especially when you're thinking about who's going to be the next Dalvin Cook. You've got concerns there if you pay too much. Brian Robinson has really blown up recently, and yet he's got a tricky profile because of the presence of Gibson. And from week 5 to week 10, he only averaged 10 carries a game. If you are in that range as a rusher, when you're also not the number 1 receiving back, there's a lot of risk. At the same time, when he has been given the chance to be the receiving back, like we saw in week 11, he has come through in a big, big way. Brian Robinson, more talented than people think. Rachaad White has been fantastic. His routes on a weekly basis are extremely high. And unlike some other backs who actually are out there quite a bit, he comes through with a lot of targets, and he's been terrible as a runner. He's been fantastic as a receiver. If you've got to be one or the other, and your team uses you as a receiver, choose being a receiver. That's where you're in space. We have Josh Jacobs here. I mean, Jacobs gains about as many yards out there as your 6th, 7th string running back would do, but he's Josh Jacobs. You know people are going to be interested in him. And then RHAMONDRE Stevenson, big bounce back play the rest of the way. Add him at your peril. Colm, who's the most interesting of these players?
Well, I think, Shawn, the most interesting part is some of the descriptions that you've used in this piece, which I really enjoyed while reading through it. So you did mention the end line there of the RHAMONDRE Stevenson part, but you didn't add the start. You said, I still believe in Stevenson, but add him at your peril. So I enjoyed that. The other one is that the Bucs are essentially the anti-Jaguars. So he talked about how, we would like to see Travis Etienne used in that offense. Maybe we get him some more of these targets. They are aggressively targeting Rachaad White. This tier, Shawn, feels to me like an elevator, escalator kind of situation where the next, and I guess you could say this is true as well for Walker as to how the season finishes out, but over the rest of the season, there's a huge amount of these guys that can either go up a tier or down a tier. And it really feels that way. So, you have the aging guys like KAMARA and an EKELER in there. You have Montgomery, who's had a fantastic season thus far, as you mentioned, in that split. But you have JAVONTE, you have Brian Robinson, you have White. Then you have the likes of Jacobs and Stevenson back in the veteran categories, where I think so much of their fantasy value moving forward is dependent on this next couple of weeks. And in this particular tier, you start to see as we go through the names moving forward that the range of outcomes in terms of value dropping off gets significantly riskier. And when we're in a tier like this, I'm always more likely to target the younger players, because if those older players start to fall off towards the end of the season or pick up an injury, the value can plummet very, very quickly. Still think JAVONTE is interesting, and I think Stevenson is interesting. But I have acquired over the course of the season Brian Robinson on a couple of teams. I have acquired Rachaad White over the last month on one of the dynasty rosters that I have. And I think that White is intriguing because the running game is just so bad for him, but the receiving side is very good. But JAVONTE is probably the one, Shawn, that I have the high. If I was looking at who has the most upside in this group over the next 6 weeks, I think JAVONTE has it, but I also think that he could be on that escalator on the way down if the Broncos, again, don't try to get him into a more elevated position of need in terms of their play calling.
Well, it sounds like you are on board with sending out a trade offer to JJ and his partner, who appear to be the top team to miss the playoffs. They do have a decent little gap between their victory points and the final spot. They might be willing to trade McCollum. I know that JJ agrees with you and is also on the Javonte Williams bandwagon. It might be difficult to peel that future star away. We have quite a few tiers remaining. Tier 6 around 2 and around 3. Tier 7 is just around 2. Little spoiler, Joe Mixon and Najee Harris fall into that group. Some positive things about Najee Harris in the article, so don't think that it's all doom and gloom for him. Tier 8, around 3.
You wrote those positive things?
I did.
Okay.
You got to give people credit where credit is due. He's broken some tackles. I do think that if Harris were in a decent offense, he'd be having a good year this year. Isaiah Pacheco, the headliner of Tier 8, We have tier 9, which is down to basically any pick value, where guys we love like Chuba and, man, Colin, when I'm looking at Alexander Madison's chart here, I mean, this is like
a lot of negative points.
Well, you take like the worst game that Joe Mixon has, and Joe Mixon has a lot of these, and he has a lot of these every year, but Alexander Madison's full season, like every game, is like a bad game from Joe Mixon. And I hope that he has some good games going forward, because Alexander Madison seems like a really cool guy, and he's definitely going to get the touches. And then we have a few exciting handcuffs at the end. Colm, anybody else that we need to let the listeners know about? A couple of other things here. We have some matchup numbers in. We have information from the RotoViz Strength of Schedule streamer. Again, if you're trying to figure out how you need to make your moves to set your rosters up to win that title, we are in the phase now where it's winning time, Colm. So we want to come through with those. What are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts is there's one player in this list, Shawn, who I think could be the biggest mover on the entire list. He is currently sitting here in tier 6. So that's a round 2 and a round 3 pick that you'll be giving up. He's in the same tier as Charbonnet, Williams, Mostert, Cook. This guy, Shawn's name is Jaylen Warren. We get the coaching change, or the offensive coordinator change. We'll see that there is some smoke being, sent that it's going to help Jaylen Warren moving forward. I don't know. I don't know if Kenny Pickett's going to help Jaylen Warren moving forward. But the other line that I mentioned, some of the lines, one of the ones that stood out to me was that your description of Warren is that Warren is an absolute madman who does something new and crazy every week. And that's the sort of guy, Shawn, that I want to have on my fantasy rosters moving forward. But they also, and again, it comes down to what is happening with the entire offense. But in terms of running back strength of schedule from week 12 to week 17, Pittsburgh is up there with the best remaining strength of schedule for the running back position. And we have seen it over the course of the season, the big plays that are happening, the 74-yard touchdown this past week, but then kind of faded into the background after that particular point. But I feel like Warren could have a strong end to the season here and really push himself from that tier 6, not all the way up, but maybe into the tier 4, tier 3 range.
You heard it here first. Jaylen Warren pushing Bijan Robinson for the top spot in Colm's rankings by the end of the season. Look for the coaching change to unleash the Pittsburgh Steelers.
The one thing I'll say, Shawn, is I have been putting out the Jaylen Warren propaganda all off season and all season, and it's got us to this point, but it's still not where we want to be. We need to keep pushing it forward.
He's looked very, very good. A raft of advanced stats in the article here that are pretty difficult to believe. You may think that he's been fantastic. You check out the numbers, you realize he's even better than you might realize.
So that is going to do it for this edition. Again, as we mentioned at the start, thank you to everyone who tunes in, who subscribes, who leaves a written review. If you have left one before, or if you haven't left one at all, you can update it or drop a new one. It really helps us out a lot. If you are watching this over on YouTube, drop us a comment down below, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We'd really appreciate that. But this is going to do it for this edition of the show. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on RotoViz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.